He wasn't supposed to stop that day, but something small and trembling stood in the middle of the road and refused to let him pass. The morning air carried a faint chill, the kind that lingered just before the sun fully claimed the sky, and the quiet suburban street stretched ahead in long, empty lines of cracked asphalt and trimmed lawns. Lucas Grant drove his usual route, one hand resting on the steering wheel of his mail truck, the other loosely holding a stack of envelopes he'd sorted without thinking. Routine had become his refuge. No surprises, no risks, no second chances to fail. The engine hummed low, tires crunching softly over gravel as he approached the bend, and that's when he saw it. A small shape, barely more than a shadow at first, standing right in the center of his path. He slowed instinctively, narrowing his eyes. A puppy, German shepherd, maybe 8 weeks old, its coat dusty and uneven, ears not fully standing yet, legs too thin for its body. It didn't bark. It didn't run. It just stood there, chest rising too fast, eyes locked on him like it had been waiting. Lucas tapped the brake harder, the truck rolling to a stop just a few feet away. "Hey," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than the animal. The puppy took a step forward, then another, slow, careful, as if every movement cost it something. Lucas frowned, glancing around. No houses nearby with open gates. No owners calling out. Just silence. The kind of silence he had learned to distrust years ago. He opened the truck door, boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud, and crouched slightly, keeping his distance. "You lost, buddy." The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. The puppy didn't wag its tail, didn't whimper. It just stared, then lowered its head and moved closer, stopping just inches from his boots. For a second, neither of them moved. The world held its breath. Then, gently, so gently it almost didn't happen, the puppy nudged his pant leg. Not for comfort, not for affection. It pulled. A small tug, weak but deliberate. Lucas stiffened. The motion stirred something deep in his chest, something he had spent years trying to bury. Signals. Requests. Moments that demanded a decision. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "Not today." But the puppy didn't listen. It turned, took a few unsteady steps away, then looked back. Waiting. Lucas felt the weight of that look settle into him like cold water. He glanced at the mail truck, at the neatly organized route he was already behind on, at the life he had carefully reduced to something predictable and safe. Then back at the dog. The puppy swayed slightly, catching itself before falling, and took another step forward, pausing again to make sure he was still there. Still watching. Still choosing. Lucas ran a hand over his face, the roughness of his palm grounding him in the moment. "You've got to be kidding me," he murmured, but his feet were already moving. One step, then another. He followed, not because he wanted to, not because it made sense, but because something in the way that small creature moved, fragile, determined, refusing to give up, felt like a call he could no longer ignore. The street faded behind them as the puppy led him toward a narrow path between two abandoned lots, the grass overgrown and bending in the light breeze. Each step it took seemed harder than the last, yet it never stopped. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas felt it, the quiet pull of something larger than routine, larger than fear. Something that didn't ask if he was ready, only if he was willing. The path narrowed as they moved deeper between the empty lots, the trimmed edges of suburbia, giving way to something quieter, something forgotten, where the air carried a faint scent of damp wood and sun-warmed dust, and the sound of the world softened into distant hums and the gentle whisper of wind through overgrown grass. And Lucas found himself slowing, not because the puppy did, but because something about the place pressed against his senses in a way he could not ignore, the kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. And ahead of him the small German shepherd continued on, its steps uneven now, its back legs trembling slightly with each movement, yet it never looked away for long, always glancing back, always checking, as if making sure he had not disappeared like everything else in its world. And Lucas exhaled through his nose, steady but tight, his eyes scanning the path, the broken fence line to the right, the rusted mailbox leaning at an angle as though it had given up holding itself upright years ago. And he noticed then how far they had come, how the clean lines of mail routes and neat driveways had vanished behind him, replaced by a stretch of land that no longer belonged to anyone who cared enough to maintain it. and still the puppy pressed forward, one small step at a time, until it reached the edge of a clearing where the grass thinned out into patches of dry earth and scattered debris. And there it paused longer than before, its body lowering slightly, chest rising and falling faster now. And Lucas felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet warning that whatever waited ahead was not simple, not easy, and certainly not something he could just walk away from once he saw it. And he stepped closer, boots crunching softly over loose gravel, his gaze lifting toward the structure that stood just beyond the clearing. An old house, if it could still be called that. Its paint long since peeled away, windows clouded with grime and time, the porch sagging under its own weight as though it had been holding on out of habit rather than strength. And the puppy let out a faint sound, not quite a whimper, more like a breath that had finally found its way out after being held too long. And it moved again, slower now, guiding him toward the steps. And Lucas hesitated for just a second, his instincts pulling in two directions, one urging him to turn back, to return to the safety of routine and distance, the other pushing him forward with a quiet insistence that felt familiar in a way he could not fully name. And then he noticed it. The air near the house was different, heavier somehow, carrying a faint, almost unnoticeable scent that did not belong to empty places, something living, something struggling, and his jaw tightened as he stepped onto the first creaking board of the porch, the sound echoing softly into the hollow interior, and the puppy stopped beside him, its small body swaying before it steadied itself, lifting its head just enough to look at him again, those amber eyes no longer pleading, but certain, as if this was the place, as if whatever it had been trying to say all along had finally brought them here. And Lucas swallowed, the dry weight of the moment settling in his throat, and for a heartbeat he stood there, suspended between who he had been and who he had tried to become, between the man who once ran toward danger without hesitation and the one who had learned to avoid it at all costs. And then, slowly, he reached for the door, his hand hovering just inches from the worn wood, feeling the quiet tremor in his fingers, and the puppy lowered itself to the floor beside him, not from weakness alone, but as if it had reached the end of its strength, the end of its journey, trusting that the rest now belonged to him. And in that silence, with nothing but the faint wind brushing against the broken walls and the soft, uneven breathing of something unseen inside, Lucas made his choice and pushed the door open. The door opened with a slow, uneven creak, the sound stretching into the hollow space inside like it had not been heard in years, and Lucas paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through dusty windows, thin beams cutting across the room and catching particles in the air that drifted lazily like forgotten time. And the smell reached him first, faint but unmistakable now, not sharp or overwhelming, but heavy with something that did not belong to an empty house, something that spoke of life holding on by a thread. And he stepped inside, his boots pressing softly against warped wooden floorboards that shifted under his weight, each step careful, deliberate, as if the space itself demanded respect. And behind him the puppy let out a weak breath, a sound barely there, and then silence again. And Lucas glanced back briefly, seeing the small body curled near the doorway, watching, waiting, trusting. And that trust settled deeper into him than he expected, heavier than the mailbag he had left behind, heavier than the routine he had abandoned without thinking. And he turned forward again, moving deeper into the room, his gaze sweeping slowly, taking in the broken furniture, the overturned chair, the thin layer of dust that covered everything like a quiet surrender. And then he heard it, so faint at first he thought it might have been the house itself settling, a soft, uneven sound, like a breath that struggled to find rhythm. And he froze, listening, every part of him alert in a way he had not felt in years. And there it was again, just beyond the next room, a low, fragile exhale that did not belong to wood or wind. And Lucas moved toward it, each step measured, the air growing heavier as he crossed the threshold into a smaller space where the light barely reached. And then he saw her, lying against the far wall, a German shepherd, her coat dull and matted in places, her body still except for the faint rise and fall of her chest, and her eyes, half open, flickered toward him with a quiet awareness that held no fear, only exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like relief. And beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, was a small bundle wrapped in a worn blanket, and Lucas felt the world narrow to that single point, his breath catching as he stepped closer, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing, because it was not just the dog, not just the fragile life holding on in front of him, but the shape of something else, something smaller, something human, and he knelt down slowly, the floor creaking beneath him as he reached out with careful hands, pulling back the edge of the blanket just enough to reveal a tiny face, eyes closed, breathing shallow but steady, a child, left here in the quiet, in the stillness, in a place no one would think to look, and Lucas swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest, not with panic, but with a deep, steady urgency that felt familiar in a way that cut through everything else, and the dog shifted slightly, her head lifting just an inch before settling again, her gaze never leaving him, as if asking a question she no longer had the strength to voice, and Lucas met that gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition, a silent agreement, and he nodded once, almost without realizing it, his voice low but certain as he reached for his phone with steady hands. "I have got you." And in that moment, the quiet house no longer felt empty. It felt like the center of something fragile and important, something that had waited just long enough for him to arrive. And somewhere behind him, near the open door, the small puppy let out one last soft breath, as if finally letting go of the burden it had carried to bring him here. Lucas moved with a quiet urgency that felt older than the moment, something trained into his bones long before this house, long before the silence, long before he learned how to avoid situations exactly like this, and his hands were steady as he pulled his phone free, dialing emergency services while his eyes never left the small rise and fall of the child's chest, counting each breath without realizing he was doing it, measuring time in seconds that felt heavier than minutes. And when the operator answered, his voice came out low and controlled, each word precise, giving the location, describing what he saw without panic, without hesitation, as if he had stepped back into a role he once knew too well, and yet beneath that calm there was something else, something tighter, something personal. And when the call ended, he placed the phone beside him and leaned closer to the child, adjusting the worn blanket gently, making sure it covered enough, shielding from the draft that slipped through broken window frames. And the German shepherd beside the child watched him the entire time, her breathing shallow but present, her eyes following every movement with a quiet intensity that spoke of both exhaustion and trust. And Lucas reached out slowly, letting his hand rest lightly against her side, feeling the faint warmth there, the fragile proof that she was still holding on, and he nodded again, almost unconsciously, as if reaffirming a promise that did not need words. And then he glanced toward the doorway, toward the small puppy that had brought him here, and something in his chest tightened when he saw how still it had become, its body curled near the threshold, sides barely moving, and Lucas pushed himself to his feet, crossing the room quickly but carefully, kneeling beside the puppy and sliding one hand gently beneath its small frame, lifting it just enough to feel the faint, uneven rhythm of its breathing, and for a brief second his throat tightened, a memory pressing in from somewhere he had buried deep, a moment years ago where he had felt this same fragile pulse slipping beneath his hands, and he closed his eyes just long enough to steady himself before opening them again, bringing the puppy closer to his chest, sharing what little warmth he could, and he spoke softly, not expecting a response. "You did good. You hear me. You did real good." And the puppy did not move much, but its ears twitched just slightly, as if somewhere beneath the exhaustion it heard him, and Lucas exhaled slowly, holding onto that small sign like it mattered more than anything else, because right now it did, and outside, far in the distance, he thought he heard it, the faint echo of sirens cutting through the morning air, still, far away but coming, and the sound shifted something inside him, not relief exactly, but a release of tension he had been carrying since the moment he saw that small figure in the road. And he moved back toward the child and the mother dog, settling down again, positioning himself so he could keep all three within reach, one hand resting near the child, the other still supporting the puppy against him. And the room felt different now, not as empty, not as forgotten, but filled with a quiet purpose, a fragile line stretched between survival and loss. And Lucas stayed there, listening to the uneven rhythm of breathing around him, matching his own to it without thinking, grounding himself in the present, in what could still be done. And as the distant sirens grew just a little louder, he realized something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not since before he walked away from the life he used to lead. That this moment was not about what he had lost, or what he had failed to save. It was about what was still here, still breathing, still waiting, and for the first time in years, he did not look away from it. The sound of the sirens grew stronger now, no longer a distant echo but a steady approach cutting through the stillness like a promise that had taken too long to arrive. And Lucas lifted his head slightly, listening, measuring the distance the way he once did in a different life, calculating without thinking, and he knew they were close, just a few minutes out, maybe less, but time had already stretched thin inside that house, each second carrying weight that refused to pass quietly. And he shifted his position carefully, keeping the puppy cradled against his chest while leaning closer to the child again, watching the small, fragile breaths, counting them, grounding himself in their rhythm. And then he noticed something he had not seen before, a small piece of fabric tucked near the child's blanket, barely visible against the worn floor, and he reached for it slowly, careful not to disturb anything, lifting it just enough to see what it was, a tiny shirt, clean compared to everything else around it, folded with care, and beneath it, a small card. Edges slightly bent but protected from the dust, and Lucas hesitated for just a moment before picking it up, his fingers steady but deliberate. And when he turned it over, he saw a name written in careful handwriting, not rushed, not careless, but intentional, as if someone had wanted it to be found. And below the name, a single word, simple, almost too simple for what it carried, please. And Lucas felt something shift deep in his chest, not pain, not anger, but something heavier, something that settled quietly and refused to move. And he looked back at the child, then at the mother dog. And for a moment the room seemed to hold a story that had not been spoken, a story of someone who had not abandoned without thought, but had made a choice in desperation, leaving behind the one thing they could not carry any further, trusting that somehow, someone would come. And Lucas exhaled slowly, placing the card back where he found it, not out of indifference, but out of respect, as if the message had already done what it needed to do. And the puppy shifted slightly in his arms, a small movement that brought his focus back to the present, and he adjusted his grip gently, his hand brushing over the soft fur, feeling the warmth still there, faint but holding. And he spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a promise shared between them. Just a little longer. And the puppy's breathing steadied just enough to be noticed, not stronger, not fully safe, but still there, still fighting. And outside, the sound of tires on gravel broke through the air, followed by doors opening, voices calling out, clear and urgent, but not chaotic, trained voices, steady voices, and Lucas felt the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly, not because the moment was over, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. And footsteps approached the porch, boards creaking under new weight, and a voice called from the doorway. Anyone inside? And Lucas turned his head just enough to respond, his voice calm, anchored. In here. And within seconds the room filled with movement, careful, controlled, hands reaching, assessing, checking, voices exchanging quiet information that flowed like a system designed to hold fragile moments together. And Lucas did not step back immediately. He stayed where he was, guiding them with small gestures, pointing, explaining without needing to say much. And when one of the responders knelt beside him, gently taking the puppy into trained hands, Lucas hesitated for the briefest moment before letting go, his fingers lingering just long enough to feel that faint warmth one last time. And as the child was lifted carefully, wrapped securely, and the mother dog attended to with quiet efficiency, Lucas remained there on the worn wooden floor, his hands now empty, but his chest heavier than before, not with regret, but with something unfamiliar, something that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. And as the room shifted from stillness to motion, from silence to quiet urgency, Lucas realized that the small life that had stepped into his path that morning had not just asked for help. It had given him something he had not known he was still capable of finding, a reason to step forward again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. The house emptied slowly, not all at once, but in careful layers, like something fragile being lifted. piece by piece from a place that had held it too long, and Lucas stood just outside on the uneven porch, the morning light now stronger, cutting through the dust and shadow that clung to the doorway behind him. And he watched as the responders moved with quiet coordination, one carrying the child wrapped securely, another guiding the stretcher that held the mother dog, their movements efficient but gentle, voices low, respectful, as if they understood that this was more than a call, more than a task. It was a moment that required care beyond protocol. And then he saw the smallest one again, the puppy, cradled in careful hands, its body still but no longer alone, and something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange, unfamiliar hope that felt fragile enough to break if he held it too tightly. And he stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the ground with a soft thud, following just close enough to see without getting in the way, and one of the responders glanced back at him, offering a brief nod, the kind shared between people who do not need many words to understand what has just happened, and Lucas returned it with a slight tilt of his head, his hands now empty at his sides, fingers curling slightly, as if remembering the weight they had held moments ago, and the ambulance doors opened with a metallic sound that echoed briefly in the quiet space. And for a second everything paused, just long enough for Lucas to see inside, to catch a glimpse of the child being secured, the mother dog being monitored, the puppy placed carefully beside them, all within reach of trained hands and steady attention. And then the doors closed, sealing that fragile world inside, and the engine started, low and steady, before the vehicle began to move, slowly at first, then turning toward the road that would carry them away from the abandoned house and into something else, something better. And Lucas stood there, watching until the sound of the engine softened into the distance, until the dust settled back into place, until the space around him felt still again, but not the same kind of stillness as before. This one felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been lifted from it, and he exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck, feeling the warmth of the sun now fully present, grounding him in a moment that felt both finished and just beginning. And behind him the house remained, quiet and worn, holding the echoes of what had been found inside. But Lucas did not turn back toward it. He kept his gaze forward, toward the road, toward the direction the ambulance had gone. And for a brief moment, he considered walking away, returning to his truck, to the route he had abandoned, to the life that had asked nothing more from him than showing up and moving on. But his feet did not move, not yet, because something inside him had shifted in a way he could not ignore, something that refused to let this moment end with distance. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone again, not with urgency this time, but with intention, his thumb hovering over the screen before making a decision that felt simple and heavy all at once. And he stepped off the gravel path, moving toward his truck, but not with the same rhythm as before, not with the same detachment. There was purpose in his stride now, quiet but steady. And when he reached the door, he paused for just a second, looking down at his hands, at the faint traces of dust still clinging to his skin, reminders of where he had been, of what he had touched, of what he had chosen not to walk away from. And he opened the door, climbing inside, but instead of reaching for the stack of mail waiting beside him, he set his phone on the dashboard, eyes fixed ahead, following the road in his mind, knowing exactly where it led. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas did not choose the path that was expected. He chose the one that mattered. The engine of the mail truck rumbled to life, but Lucas did not reach for the stack of letters beside him. He did not check the next address. He did not follow the route that had once defined his days with quiet predictability. Instead, his hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead where the ambulance had disappeared just minutes earlier. And for a brief moment, the old habit whispered to him, "Finish the route, stay on schedule, keep moving forward the way you always have." But that voice felt distant now, weaker than it had ever been, because something else had taken its place, something quieter but far more certain. And without another thought, he shifted the truck into gear and pulled onto the road, tires rolling over the same path, yet heading somewhere entirely different. And the town passed by in familiar fragments, houses, storefronts, intersections he had driven through hundreds of times, but none of it held his attention the way it used to, because every mile now felt like it carried purpose instead of routine. And the drive to the hospital was not long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, But time stretched again in a different way, not heavy, not pressing, just suspended, as if the outcome of something still hung just beyond reach. And when he finally turned into the hospital lot, the sight of the ambulance parked near the entrance grounded him, a quiet confirmation that he had not imagined any of it, that what he had seen, what he had chosen, was real and still unfolding. And he parked without thinking, stepping out quickly, the warm air brushing against his face as he moved toward the doors, each step steady, but carrying something beneath it, something that felt like urgency mixed with something softer, something closer to hope. And inside the hospital the air shifted, cooler, cleaner, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and the low hum of voices and distant movement. And Lucas slowed just slightly, his eyes scanning until he spotted one of the responders from earlier speaking with a nurse near the front desk. And when their eyes met there was recognition, brief but clear, and Lucas approached, not rushing, but not hesitating either, and the responder nodded once before speaking quietly, giving him a simple update. No long explanations, just enough. The child was stable, the mother dog was receiving care, the puppy was still being monitored, and Lucas listened without interrupting, each word settling into him with a weight that was no longer overwhelming but grounding. And he exhaled slowly, nodding in return, not asking questions he already knew would not have immediate answers, not pushing beyond what was being offered, because for now, knowing they were still here, still fighting, was enough. And he stepped back, moving toward the waiting area, choosing a seat near the window where the sunlight filtered through softly. And for the first time since the morning began, he allowed himself to sit still, really still, hands resting on his knees, gaze lowered, not from exhaustion alone but from the quiet realization that he had crossed a line he had been avoiding for years, a line between distance and involvement, between watching life happen and stepping into it when it mattered. And the minutes passed without him noticing exactly how many, the sounds of the hospital blending into a steady background, until eventually a nurse approached, her expression calm, professional, but softened by something more human. And she spoke his name after asking for it at the desk, and when he looked up, there was a small shift in her tone, a quiet reassurance carried in simple words, "They are going to make it." And Lucas held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to feel the truth of it settle fully. And when it did, something inside him finally released, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in a slow, steady exhale that he had been holding for longer than he realized. And he nodded once, his voice low when he responded, "Thank you." And as the nurse walked away, Lucas leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes lifting toward the light. And for the first time in a long time, the silence around him did not feel empty, it felt earned. The hours did not pass quickly, but they no longer dragged the way they once had. Instead, they settled into a quiet rhythm, marked by the soft footsteps of nurses, the distant hum of machines, and the occasional murmur of voices that carried through the hallway like low echoes of life continuing beyond the waiting room. And Lucas remained seated near the window, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if some part of him still stood watch even while the rest of him tried to rest. And every so often his eyes would lift toward the corridor where the doors led deeper into the hospital, not out of impatience, but out of a quiet connection to what lay beyond them. And eventually the same nurse returned, her expression unchanged in its calm. But there was something more certain in the way she approached him this time, something that did not need to be explained in detail, and she gestured gently, inviting him to follow. And Lucas rose without hesitation, his steps measured as he walked beside her down the hallway, the polished floor reflecting soft light beneath them. And when they reached the room, she paused at the door, giving him a brief nod before stepping aside. And Lucas stood there for a second, his hand resting lightly against the frame, as if acknowledging the moment before stepping inside. And the room was quiet, not empty, but filled with a stillness that felt different from the house. This stillness held care, presence, and something close to peace. And his gaze moved first to the small bed where the child lay, wrapped now in clean blankets, breathing steady, the rise and fall of the chest gentle and consistent. And something in Lucas eased further at the sight, a tension he had not even noticed finally releasing. And then he turned slightly, his eyes finding the mother dog resting on a padded surface nearby, her body still but her breathing stronger now, more even, and her eyes opened slowly as he stepped closer, meeting his with a recognition that seemed to reach beyond the hours that had passed, and Lucas lowered himself slightly, not too close, just enough to let her see him clearly, and he gave a small nod, the same one he had given before, a quiet confirmation that the promise still stood, and then, from a smaller space just beside her, there came a faint sound, soft but unmistakable, and Lucas turned his head, his breath catching for just a moment as he saw the puppy again, resting on a clean towel, its small body rising and falling, in a rhythm that was still fragile but present, and one of its ears twitched slightly as if responding to something unseen, and Lucas felt something shift in his chest, not sharply, not suddenly, but in a slow, steady way that filled the space inside him with something warmer than before, and he stepped closer, his hand hovering for a second before gently resting against the edge of the surface where the puppy lay, not touching directly, but close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from its small body, and he spoke quietly, his voice softer than it had been all day. "You made it." And the puppy stirred just slightly, a small movement that might have been nothing to anyone else, but to Lucas it was enough, more than enough, and he stayed there for a moment longer, not needing to say anything else, not needing to do anything more, because the moment itself held everything it needed, and as he straightened up, his gaze moved once more between the child, the mother dog, and the puppy, three lives that had intersected with his in a way he had not expected. And he understood then that what had brought him here was not just chance, not just a break in routine, but something quieter, something that had been waiting for him to choose differently. And as he stepped back toward the door, the nurse watching quietly from the hallway, Lucas carried that understanding with him, not as a burden, but as something steady, something that would not fade when he left this place. And for the first time in a long while, he did not wonder what came next. He simply accepted that whatever it was, he would not walk past it again. The hallway felt quieter when Lucas stepped out of the room, as if the world had softened its edges just enough to let the moment settle. And he did not rush this time. He did not carry urgency in his stride, only a steady calm that moved with him as naturally as breath. And when he reached the waiting area again, he did not sit right away. Instead, he stood near the window, looking out at the late morning light stretching across the parking lot, the same light that had followed him since the moment he chose to stop, and for a while he simply stood there, letting everything that had happened find its place inside him, not forcing it, not questioning it, just allowing it to be. And in that quiet, his mind did not return to the house, not to the dust or the silence or the fragile moment of discovery. It stayed with what he had just seen, the steady breathing of a child, the calm strength returning to a mother who had not given up, and the small, stubborn life that had carried hope across an empty road and placed it directly in his path. And Lucas exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the glass, feeling the warmth of the sun through it, grounding him in something simple and real. And then he heard it, soft and light, the faint sound of footsteps approaching. And when he turned, it was the same nurse, her expression gentle but purposeful, and she held something in her hands, a small bundle wrapped in a clean cloth. And Lucas did not need to ask, he already knew. And as she stepped closer, she spoke quietly, explaining that the puppy would need time, care, and someone willing to stay with it through that fragile beginning. And she did not say more than that. She did not ask directly, but the meaning was clear. And Lucas looked down at the small shape in her arms, watching the subtle rise and fall of its breathing, the slight movement of its ears, and for a moment the world narrowed again, not into tension, but into clarity, and he reached out slowly, his hands steady as he accepted the weight, so light, and yet carrying more meaning than anything he had held in years. And as the puppy settled against him, something shifted fully into place inside his chest, not a question, not a hesitation, but a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. And he nodded once, not to the nurse, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself. And the nurse gave a small smile before stepping back, leaving him there with the gentle warmth in his arms. And Lucas looked down at the puppy, his voice low, almost a whisper meant only for it. "You are not alone anymore." And the puppy stirred faintly, pressing just slightly into the space it had been given, as if recognizing something it had been searching for all along, and Lucas adjusted his hold carefully, protective without thinking, natural in a way that surprised him. And as he turned back toward the window, the light caught across them both, soft and steady. And for a brief moment, everything felt still again, but not empty, not uncertain. This stillness held something else, something earned, something quietly whole. And Lucas understood then that some paths do not announce themselves with signs or choices. They appear in the smallest forms, in trembling steps and silent requests, and they ask only one thing: whether you will stop, whether you will listen, whether you will follow. And as he stood there, holding the life that had changed the course of his day, Lucas knew that sometimes the most important decisions are not made in moments of strength, but in moments of pause, when something small refuses to be ignored. And in choosing not to walk away, he had not just helped save a life, he had found something he thought he had lost, a quiet purpose that did not demand anything more than presence. And as the light continued to fall across the room, Lucas remained there, still and steady, no longer searching for what came next. Because for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he needed to be.